Hello, my name is Dr. Jacqueline, and I'm with DTP Leadership Group. This is Hot Topic, Bold Talk. This is podcast 114, and I've entitled it Jimmy Carter, A Legacy of Service, Morality, and Humanity. I know this podcast is going to come out at 7 a.m. on the same day that we have the funeral for Jimmy Carter. I have great respect for him, and I want to talk about the various resources and the things that have been said or summarized about him, because there's so many things that he did. I want to begin with the announcement by CNN about former President Jimmy Carter died at 100. Jimmy Carter, the 39th President of the United States, died Sunday at the age of 100. Carter was surrounded by his family at his home in Plains, Georgia, in his final moments, the Carter Center said. Tributes are pouring in for the former farmer, lawmaker, humanitarian, and Georgia governor who served one term as president from 1977 to 1981. President Joe Biden said, Carter stands as a model of what it means to live a life of meaning and purpose, and remembered Carter as a dear friend. President-elect Donald Trump said Americans owe the former president a debt of gratitude. Carter's wife of more than 75 years, Rosalind, died in November 2023 at the age of 96. The Carters were the longest married presidential couple in the United States history. Now, there's a much longer and more thorough obituary that was published by the Washington Post on Sunday, December 29th at 5:41 p.m. And you're going to have those references anyway at the end of this podcast, so you will be able to see those things and see if you want to. It's a very lengthy document. I highly recommend it because it gives you everything that he did in his lifetime. And I like the way that they have added something to the title of this particular article. The tenacious Southerner was turned out of office by disillusioned voters after a single term, but he had a brilliant post-presidential career as a champion of health, peace, and democracy. I also appreciate what his son said, Chip Carter. He said, my father was my hero, not only to me, but to everyone who believes in peace, human rights, and unselfish love. He went on to say, my brother, sister, and I shared him with the world because we had a common bond with the world. He brought the world to our family by bringing people together, and we thank each of you for honoring his memory. Now, as you probably read, we had public observance of his death held in Atlanta and then Washington, and of course his interment will be in Plains, Georgia. Now, President Biden, of course, proclaimed and ordered U.S. flags to be flown at half staff for 30 days in remembrance of this outstanding president. I want to talk about his legacy, though, and the challenges and the triumphs he did have. I think the most important thing I can say about Carter is he is totally the opposite of Trump. since he was a moral, ethical, and truly religious man. He taught Sunday school most of his life. He respected the world, and the world respected him. He reached out to the world. And so the reason that so many letters and so forth that come in about him saying, I lost a dear friend when Carter died, that's how they viewed him around the world. Now, Jonathan Alter has, who's an MSNBC analyst, is the author of his biography, His Best Jimmy Carter, A Life. And Alter was kind enough to write an article for the Washington Post. And this is what he said, and in the beginning of his article about Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter's presidency is ripe for a major reappraisal. His time in office is remembered most exclusively for events that were largely beyond his control. And I appreciate what he says. Goes on to say, Alter, since I was alive during Carter's presidency, and I know he was not a failed president. He was considered the greatest ex-president in the United States. And Alters gives the factual data for that statement that I've just made. Carter rejected speaking fees, corporate board memberships, and golf in favor of writing 32 books to pay his bills. And he founded the Carter Center, which has done noble work, waging peace, fighting disease, building hope, and that's their motto. Now, I want to go on with Alter's article because I think he has so much to say about President Jimmy Carter. He was not a weak president. He was a tough, intense, former naval officer. Beneath his smile, Carter was a political failure, but a substantive success. His presidency is remembered almost exclusively for a series of events that were largely beyond his control. The seizure of 52 American hostages in Iran, and then the failed efforts to rescue them. The state of the U.S. economy and how bad it was, which resulted largely from disruption in the Middle East around oil supplies, and the resumption of the Cold War with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which Soviet documents show had nothing to do with Carter's perceived weakness. Now, Alter makes it very clear that Carter was known for handling some of his political challenges and not well. In fact, Alter says it was almost as though he was politically tone deaf, and he kind of handled relations with Democratic establishments and people like Ted Kennedy, who wouldn't sign his health care bill. So it created conflict in the Democratic Party. And Kennedy ran against him for the 1980 primary, even though Carter was able to win the nomination. But I think there's more to see in who Jimmy Carter was. His glass was more than half full as a president. You know, we talk about the era of Trump and in his first presidency, where he bragged so much about two major bills he passed, the criminal justice reform and the tax cut. It's easy to forget that Carter in a Democratic Congress put more legislative points on the board than any other post-war president, except Lyndon Baines Johnson. The media coverage is incomplete on this man. His legislative achievements are things you need to hear about. The nation's first comprehensive energy policy, including the first support for renewable energy sources, was one of his legislative acts. The doubling of the national park land, which resulted from the Alaskan Land Bill, and a string of bills that strengthen environmental and consumer protection. The first civil service reform in nearly a century. The first major medical health bill, later defunded by Ronald Reagan, but the creation of two cabinet departments, energy and education, and the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA. The deregulation of airline fares, trucking routes, utilities, and the price of natural gas. The appointment of 5 times as many female judges as any president, and the presidents combined of his predecessors than any other president. The development of high-tech weaponry, the B-2 stealth bomber, helped win the Cold War. Now, he has not just accomplishments in the United States, but he has them internationally. He was a visionary. His human rights policy, and as Alter says, occasionally not consistently applied, however, he set a new standard on how government should treat their own people and help spur a democratic revolution around the world. He created this because of the way he talked about how people should be treated. The ratification of the Panama Canal treaties against great odds prevented a major war in Panama. Now, Trump keeps talking about he's going to eliminate that agreement. But most memorably, I think, was his historic deal between Israel and Egypt at Camp David. And it proved to be the most durable peace treaty since World War II. Now, Carter was eventually swamped by events, and he was stopped by Reagan in 1980. But this should not overshadow who and what he was. He made a brave and powerful decision of pardoning of draft dodgers, which helped heal the wounds of the Vietnam War. Now, I personally appreciate Alter's contrasting Carter with Reagan. Alter says, who was the best president? The one with the vision to put solar panels on the roof of the White House, Carter, or the successor who took them down, Reagan? Reagan had inflation, and he tamed it, and during his time, and the economy was revived. However, we have to realize something. The Federal Reserve chairman, Paul Volcker, was appointed by Carter in 1979, and he was the one that was able in Reagan's administration to create things that increase the power, the positive aspects of the economy, and also tamed inflation. It wasn't Reagan, it was Volcker, who was appointed by Carter. At the end of this article, he says the following: Jimmy Carter's willingness to peer over the horizon and be unpopular, his moral standards and sense of decency, made his presidency ripe for major reappraisal. Now, I think the Conversations article is also powerful because it talks about Jimmy Carter in dealing with the Cold War and his legacy around that. And I think there's a very clear picture of Carter as a very talented leader. So I want to give you some of the factual data from the conversations, because I think it gives a whole nother picture about him. The Carter Doctrine is what we're going to talk about a little bit. In his 1980 State of the Union address, Carter revealed an aggressive Cold War military plan. He declared it as the Carter Doctrine, which said that the Soviets' attempt to gain control of Afghanistan and possibly the region was regarded as a threat to U.S. interests. And Carter was prepared to meet that threat with military force. It's very interesting that we would be hearing about this as a reminder of what Carter did in the present state we're in. Carter also announced in his speech a 5-year spending initiative to modernize and strengthen the military, because there had been a post-Vietnam military cut, which had weakened the United States against the USSR. Ronald Reagan argued in the 1980 presidential campaign that Jimmy Carter risked our national security, our credibility, and damaged American purpose by sending timid and even controversial signal and contradictory as well as controversial signals to the Soviet Union. Carter's policy was based on weakness and illusion, is what Reagan said, and was very critical of him and won the election. But in 1985, President Reagan publicly acknowledged that his predecessor, Carter, demonstrated great timing in modernizing and strengthening the nation's forces, which further increased economic and diplomatic pressure on the Soviets. Reagan admitted publicly that he felt very bad for misstating Carter's policies and record on defense. Carter is most lauded today for his post-presidency activism and his public service. It's the reason that he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2002. But that praise is at a significant portion of Carter's presidential accomplishments, because we haven't even heard the detail of what he did beyond some of the things that are well known about his foreign policy, about how he emphasized human rights, and he dismantled the powerful Soviet Union. I think one of the greatest characteristics he had was his humility. And this is written about in the Washington Post. The article is entitled "Jimmy Carter Made Enemies and Then Peace. Ask Ford, Kennedy, and Clinton." And I'm going to give you the example of Ford. You certainly can read the others in this particular article. Again, you will have all the references at the end of this podcast. During the time of his rather bruising 1976 presidential campaign, Carter made some very derogatory comments about President Gerald Ford. He called him incompetent, and he said he was morally, politically, and intellectually bankrupt. But after Carter, a Democrat, unseated the Republican incumbent in a close race, he praised Carter at his inaugural address. Here's what he said: "For myself and for our nation, I want to thank my predecessor for all he's done to heal our land." This gracious comment prompted a standing ovation for Ford. The two men began to work together on Carter's transition to power and began speaking regularly about issues, including how to revive the economy and ratifying the Panama Canal Treaty. In time, they became exceptionally close friends. Now, I'm going to deviate for a moment and say Carter didn't make friends with everyone because he was distressed by what Ronald Reagan had said about him, and also about the fact that Reagan had dismantled many of Carter's policies and environmental effects he had, that he was trying to get the nation to not be so reliant on gas and oil. But to a degree, really seen in modern politics, Carter was determined throughout his life to reconcile with many of his political adversaries. Not just Ford, but he also spent time resolving his issues with Senator Edward M. Kennedy. Carter was proud of his unlikely friendship with Ford and described it as one of the closest bonds between two former presidents. And they both agreed that the one who was still alive was just to speak at the other's funeral. So when Ford died in 2006, Carter stood in front of Ford's flag-draped casket in a Michigan church and talked about what he and his former rival shared in common. They had both served in the Navy. They both married strong women. They had raised 3 sons and a daughter, and they were committed to their religious faith and public service. They also often joked about the fact that they thoroughly enjoyed being promoted to the commander-in-chief. Now, interestingly enough, Carter had helped Ford had helped Carter build a relationship with the Egyptian president, Anwar Sadat. So when Carter mediated the Camp David peace between Egypt and Israel, it was due to what Ford had done to help him build that relationship. When he got the resolution to that and the peace deal done, he was on Air Force One and he called Ford and told him what had happened. And so it's a nod to give him credit and say, Ford, thank you for what you've done, because I couldn't have done this without you. Ford says at his funeral, the 4 of us learned to love each other. And at the funeral, it was noticed that Betty Ford nodded and Rosalind Carter was dapping her eyes that were filled with tears. Ron Neeson, Ford's White House press secretary, said in a 2023 interview, "It's pretty amazing when you consider politics these days. There is so much anger and dislike among politicians. In those days, it was a little nicer." So I want to end with some comments from me personally. When I anticipated watching the funeral of former President Jimmy Carter, and I started reading all these articles, I was really struck by the profound impact he had in his life and the legacy he has left us. The tributes that have come from leaders all over the world, the immense respect that he has garnished, and it's all due to his integrity, his compassion, and his tireless service. The outpouring of admiration for his contribution underscores deeply how he touched the lives of so many people. So I want to end this podcast by saying Jimmy Carter's life is a powerful reminder of what it means to lead with integrity, compassion, and purpose. Yes, he was criticized. And history now reveals a leader who faced extraordinary challenges with resilience and moral clarity. Carter's post-presidential years were ones of service, building homes for homeless, eradicating disease, and championing peace. In a world often divided, Carter's life serves, I think, as a way to call us together and say, let's build bridges where we have divides. Let's prioritize humanity and lead with love. His enduring legacy, I think, will indeed be something that can inspire all of us to be reminded that a life lived for others is a life lived well. I want to say something to you. I hope you read this or you listen to it, because it's coming out on the very day of his funeral. But I ask you to think about him a lot and what he taught us. And one of the things that I made a decision to do is I have a very dear friend, Shonda Gilbert. We have known each other for 50 years. And so in my next podcast, I decided to have the two of us talk about our relationship, about the challenges we've had, about the changes we've made, and about our commitment to building bridges rather than walls. So I want to name that because my writing of this podcast about Jimmy Carter led me to something that I think is going to be a powerful experience for you next week in podcast 115 with Shanti and myself. Thank you for listening.